Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be seeing if World of Tanks 2.0 will save the game of World of Tanks. And just to get this out of the way right now, obviously the title and thumbnail are there to get you to click on the video. The overall state of World of Tanks, to characterize it as dying, is a bit of an overstatement. Realistically, while the player base has been shrinking ever so slightly, it would be more accurate to say the game has effectively plateaued. If the decline of World of Tanks were to stay static, it would still take many years for the game to ultimately die off. That being said, when you do start dealing with large properties like World of Tanks or like Call of Duty, they do have a large buffer in which they can try to make changes and correct course to either get new players or retain existing ones. So while World of Tanks wasn't exactly dying before 2.0, it did have some issues with growth. And also, as one final foreword before I really get started into the content itself, mainly as a War Thunder content creator, I still want World of Tanks to succeed. I have serious doubts that Gaijin would magically become a better company if they were not worried about losing players to World of Tanks, and I also have serious doubts that Wargaming would become a better company if they weren't worried about losing players to War Thunder. I think the competition between these two games is what makes for a much healthier environment for basically all of the players of both games. And one thing that I do want to get out of the way right now before I start going into the nuts and bolts of 2.0 is that up until the October patch, World of Tanks is currently running a special where simply by logging in, you will get very significant rewards. If you have an old timer account, you will get different rewards from if you have a brand new account, but the rewards generally boil down to a large pile of silver, some premium time, and also a tier 10 vehicle of your choice, along with the tier 6, 7, 8, and 9 vehicles leading up to it, fully upgraded and purchased. So there are actually some pretty substantial rewards just for logging in, and as I've said a lot with free-to-play games, the only thing you have to lose by giving it a shot is time. So if you do have an afternoon free, go ahead and make an account just to get the rewards, even if you don't ultimately end up playing the game long term. Additionally, if you do decide to check the game out, Watt Plus is currently doing a 30-day free trial, even if you've already had your 30-day free trial of Watt Plus, so feel free to sign up for that, although you should probably do the same thing I do and instantly remove the auto renewal option from it when you do sign up for the free trial. And if you're curious which tier 10 I picked, well, it had to be the Progetto 65. While I had some tier 10 tanks before I got it on my old account, the Progetto 65 was the first tier 10 tank I really fell in love with. I really like the Italian auto reloader playstyle. It's just incredibly fun, it's incredibly active, and it gives you a lot of interesting options and choices in any given situation. So obviously I had to pick that up, even though it didn't have any of the new shiny tier 11s branching off of it. But don't worry, I will feature a tier 11 and some of my thoughts on tier 11s in general later in this video. So the first thing you'll notice when you open up World of Tanks is that you have a brand new garage and a brand new UI, and honestly the entire UI is not different, just the main garage UI, because if you go to the crew panel, this is basically the same as what you had before, and same is true of the store and a bunch of other stuff. So it's mostly just window dressing. It is now a tank garage instead of being outdoorsy like the old one. Obviously, if you prefer the old outdoorsy UI or the new UI, it's basically just going to be personal preference in terms of the garage. They did say all of them were interconnected, but I didn't really see any way in which the parts of the garage were more interconnected now than they used to be, so it's whatever. The big thing that I will say right now is that obviously on the right hand side of the screen you have all of the events, which is basically what War Thunder does, but to be fair, it's also what a lot of other games do in terms of organizing their general play space. Another thing that you'll notice is the left hand side of the UI, we have all of the different stores and all of that stuff, except it is semi-transparent, and I absolutely dislike semi-transparent buttons because for me personally it just doesn't really work as a feature. Just give me a nice very clear button that I can click. I don't know why we have the need to do any of this. On top of that, semi-transparent buttons, if you see them in UI like games like Battlefield or Call of Duty, what you'll notice is that Battlefield and Call of Duty have a fairly static screen that the semi-transparent UI is on. Whereas if you look at World of Tanks, you can rotate the hangar in a bunch of different directions, and when you rotate the hangar in a bunch of different directions, now the UI is maybe not as visible. So I kept kind of forgetting that that entire line was even there. Another thing that you'll notice right away is that the crew have been moved down here, but you'll also notice you can't see the crew's skills. You can see how many skills they have, but you can't immediately see them unless you mouse over them. So in order to see how much progress you have on your skills and whether or not you have any available to research, you basically have to directly click on the crew. This is one of my least favorite aspects of this because in my opinion, the crew is actually the thing that new players neglect the most. So having them very obvious on the left-hand side of the screen, telling you with a big plus sign that's glowing that maybe you should look at them, or showing your progress, is a good way to hint at new players that they should maybe be looking at that. So in general, I dislike essentially hiding the crew down here instead of having them more visible up here. I will also say that having the battle modes up here and then also having the button to go to battle up here seems a little counterintuitive. Why are the battle modes in a completely different spot from the button to go to battle? Just seems a little weird. There are some aspects of the UI that work a little bit better, such as if you want to go to customization, you just click that button. And if you want to go to the upgrades, you just have all this stuff right here. It's not too bad, but overall, I think the UI feels like it is a few extra clicks to see critical stuff like information than it really needs to be. Now, one feature the developers did add that is probably more useful to veteran players than as newer players is you can expand it out and you have this whole thing and you can separate it out into playlists, which is also just kind of what War Thunder does. War Thunder also lets you set playlists of things you can do, but it's really handy in World of Tanks in particular because you can set a bunch of vehicles that you want to do your daily missions in to try and get bonuses there, or you can set a bunch of vehicles of a similar type if you just feel like playing heavy tanks or light tanks or whatever today. So overall, I think it's a very handy feature for experienced players, although newer players probably aren't going to notice it that much. One feature that still baffles me is that they make you buy garage slots. I don't know why this is here. It seems almost entirely irrelevant and only really negatively affects new players, as veterans will have plenty of garage slots to go around, so just seems a little superfluous in that regard. Another interesting feature that was added with this update is an armor viewer, so you can see the armor of your tank, but you can only see the armor of your tank. You can't see effective thickness, you can't rotate the turret around, you can't see what different shells do or where you might need to shoot it with different types of ammunition at different ranges. So this is only the most basic level of functionality, and it took Wargaming a whopping 15 years to add this to their game when Tanks.gg does this for free, and also War Thunder added it to their game about 8 years ago. So this feels very bare minimum in terms of what they should be adding for a tank-based game where the armor really matters, in my opinion. It's too little too late. This system really needs to be expanded on and have more functionality added, in my humble opinion. One thing that you might notice if you have an existing account and you log into the game is that a lot of your vehicles now have no ammo. Essentially what Wargaming did was they reworked a lot of guns, but instead of simply changing the stats on the ammo but keeping the ammo the same, they just added new ammo and deleted the old ammo, and if you had ammo in your garage, they gave you compensation, but I'm not sure if it's one-for-one compensation. Ammo in World of Tanks is incredibly expensive, so I'm not entirely certain this actually covers the amount of ammo that you would have lost. Fortunately for me personally, I didn't have that many vehicles with full ammo loads that were affected, but I imagine for a veteran player this could actually be a pretty serious problem. This of course neatly leads into a discussion about how World of Tanks has tried to smooth out the stock grind for some vehicles. The first feature was that they removed having more than one radio, and I don't have any idea why there is still even a radio stat in the game. It is such an arbitrary feature, but whatever. There are still radios, but you don't have to research more than one. Well, I say have to. You didn't really have to research them before unless you wanted elite status for a vehicle, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, they also removed the weight limit on tracks, so you no longer have to research a specific set of tracks to get a specific turret or add some specific equipment, although that was kind of situational and it varied a bit from vehicle to vehicle as to whether or not you actually needed the updated tracks at all, so it was a very arbitrary mechanic. It's probably for the best that it's gone because it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to begin with. And of course, they also, as we just mentioned, try to smooth out the experience by rebalancing stock guns, although to be fair, they are still stock guns, they are still worse than the main gun, and it's important to realize they are still stock guns on tech tree vehicles, and you're going to be fighting quite a few premium vehicles at a lot of different battle ratings, so how much this will improve your experience will vary pretty considerably. With that being said, I will note that from what I could tell from the collector's vehicles, the collector's vehicles do appear to still have multiple radios, and collector's vehicles were not hit by the major rebalancing either. It really looks like the collector vehicles are just going to keep falling more and more behind as the game goes forward, which is a little disappointing as there are some interesting and classic vehicles in that list. And this naturally segues into the great rebalancing, with Wargaming advertising hundreds of vehicles getting adjusted. And my biggest critique here is, why do we need to adjust hundreds of vehicles? It feels like you would need to adjust less of them if you did more regular balance updates to your game. That being said, looking through some of the updates, it looks like a lot of them are just fairly minor stuff that doesn't affect how the vehicle plays. Obviously, there are some vehicles getting some more substantial buffs, but there's also a lot of them that just feel like filler buffs that don't really do anything for the vehicle. And this also wraps back around to a core problem with doing one big balance update is, if a big balance update is not accompanied with a promise to do more consistent and more regular balancing from now on, aren't you just going to end up in the same situation you were in a few more years? This is a core problem with games doing these kind of balance updates, because even if they end up being fully positive and all the balance changes are good for the game, you end up with a problem that you're just going to end up in exactly the same situation a few years down the line. So I haven't heard anything from Wargaming saying that they're going to do balance updates on a more regular basis or do broader balance updates when they do initiate them. At this point, it's still a little bit too early to tell how effective or ineffective this balance update was, but I would also say even the best case scenario, if Wargaming is not committed to trying keeping the game more balanced from here on out, then I don't see this being anything more than a band-aid. This is also coupled with another minor problem in that while Wargaming did state they were buffing several premium vehicles, there are also some more premium vehicles that are still really bad and probably need a buff, but more importantly, there are several premium vehicles that are way too good and probably need a nerf. The BZ-176 is still insanely good, and their entire balance strategy with that vehicle simply seems to be to not ever sell it again, which just doesn't really work. While I certainly have my fair share of gripes with the way War Thunder does balancing, one big example is in the Leviathans patch that released in July, where you had the MSC release for France, and it was way too good. In fact, I said it was way too good in the review for the Leviathans update, and it took less than 2 months for the MSC to get moved up in battle rating. So while War Thunder does have a lot of issues with its balancing, the balancing passes at least come fairly regularly and do hit vehicles that are overperforming, whereas World of Tanks still seems like they're going to be stuck with overperforming vehicles for months or years at a time. WOT 2.0 also rolled out a brand new matchmaker, or brand new is a stretch. They appear to already be testing it out on some of the servers prior to this, so they didn't launch basically cold, but it is essentially a change over what they used to have, or they say it was. In practice, it played about the same as it did previously in a lot of areas. The idea is that you get less games that are plus or minus 2 tiers and more games wherein vehicles that have similar capabilities are matched against each other. And while I didn't notice a huge difference in the number of games that were getting plus or minus 2 tiers versus plus or minus 1 or plus or minus 0, I did notice that I was seeing my identical twin in a lot of these matches. And what I mean by that is, specifically when I was playing my tier 11, it was the only tier 11 with its specific class, so basically every match I got paired against another tier 11 that was the exact same vehicle. This also didn't pair particularly well with Wargaming's map design philosophy, in which Wargaming really likes to produce maps where each class of vehicle has basically one place on the map that they can effectively play. So this resulted in a lot of Highlander there can only be one scenarios, because there was only one position on the map that my type of tank could use, and I was fighting my identical doppelganger for that map. Sometimes I won, sometimes my evil twin won, but it resulted in a lot of very samey gameplay against exactly the same vehicle. In this respect, I feel like tighter matchmaking can be a double-edged sword. Obviously, if 2 of the same vehicles are fighting, that's a pretty balanced interaction. However, a balanced interaction is not the same as an engaging interaction, and this is a core lesson that a lot of gamers don't seem to take to heart too well. The point of a game is to be engaging, the point of a game is not to be balanced. Ultimately, a real lack of balance can reduce engagement, but really you want the game to be interesting, and interesting requires variety. So if you're fighting the same tank every match, that's not variety, and that results in a lot of very boring and repetitive play. Of course, all of that messing around with the matchmaker has the fundamental assumption underlying it that by putting similar vehicles on both teams, you're going to create more balanced teams, except things like player skills, upgrades, and modifications start to become a very real real issue. In practice, I was having about as many games where I was running over the enemy team or getting run over by the enemy team about as often as I was under the old matchmaker, so I'm not sure how much this really changed the math in terms of how much enjoyment you're going to have over the course of a session. Two side effects of the way the new matchmaker currently works is that they effectively removed all of the other alternate game modes that you could get in a random battle. So these were the attacker defender, the neutral base, and the large battle that you only got at tier 10. So right now, at least, if you go into a random battle, all you're going to get is the standard 2-base version of every map. On top of that, they added random events to, I think, every map that is currently in the queue. Ones that didn't have them got them. So basically every map has a random event, although I'm not really sure on the timing of them. They might not be that random. On the whole, it does make a more monotonous experience because you're basically playing the exact same game mode each time. At least before, you had some variations. You would randomly pull grand battles if you were at tier 10. Sometimes the attacker defender maps could actually be pretty fun, so overall it does make the game a little bit more monotonous. One new feature that was added for the moment-to-moment gameplay, and this has been a bit of a hot button within the World of Tanks community, is an armor flashlight. What this essentially is if you are stationary and you are within about 50 meters of a target, you can press and hold down a button to have the game show you the weak points on the enemy within a small area. And honestly, when I first saw this, I had to laugh a bit. It's adorable that we're pretending that these tanks have actual real weak points that you can hit most of the time, but even beyond that, the idea that you have a penetration indicator so you could just feather it around the area to look for weak points, you could already kind of do this in most vehicles. It could potentially be helpful for newer players, or if you don't have the particular armor model of every tank memorized, you can maybe help it to try and find a weak point in a specific situation. But the only time I used it was when I was loaded standard ammo in my bat chat, and when I turned it on against the British double-barreled hold-down tank in front of me, the entire front of the vehicle was red. So all that made me want to do was find the nearest lake and drown myself. 2.0 does also feature the rollout of a brand new map, and this map is not really that interesting if I'm being completely honest. It looks cool, you have a factory, you have a rocket launch pad, all that cool stuff, but ultimately what it boils down to is you have two hold down campfests on the left and right side of the screen, and then you have the middle of the map which has a lot of dead space for light and medium tanks to move around in, and that's really about it. The number of places that you can realistically go to and fight on this map are still pretty limited despite it being a decent sized map. So honestly, I wasn't really that impressed with it. It seems like a pretty standard World of Tanks map, honestly plays like a pretty standard World of Tanks map most of the time. In any given vehicle, you're going to have one, maybe two places that you can actually use it to its best effect, and that's really about it. So I wasn't terribly impressed with it, and this does also raise the issue in that this was the only new map added with 2.0. And honestly, I feel like they could have done some more experimentation with 3 or 4 different maps that all had different design philosophies and simply let the players test them. I think this is one of the core issues that wargaming has right now, is that it almost tests things to a fault and puts way too much time into individual elements when realistically they want to get more iterations out so they can figure out what works and what doesn't. In practice, taking a really long time to develop a single map that plays exactly like the rest of them is not really giving you the best return on your investment. You would rather play a little bit more fast and loose, and those imperfections that you leave in the map, you let the player's experience tell you if those are good things that should be expanded on or bad things that should be removed. Adding a map shouldn't be treated as some immutable thing and the map will stay completely static for the next 4 or 5 years. You should treat adding a map as one of those, well, if it doesn't work, we can remove it from rotation and fix it within a few months. Wargaming, in my opinion, really needs to be more flexible with both how they design maps, but also more importantly, how they modify maps to create a more dynamic gameplay environment. And also, in general, need to be more rapid with how they make changes, not just to maps, but to other aspects of the game as well. Even if they aren't pushing out perfect solutions, they're at least pushing out a solution, which can help in the short term and give you a better idea of where you need to go in the long term. World of Tanks 2.0 does prominently feature a brand new single-player mission. You can complete it on normal difficulty or rigorous difficulty. In the background, you'll see some gameplay from rigorous difficulty. Honestly, I found the game mode was actually pretty easy if you can get past one specific part at the very beginning. You start out in a tier 8 M26 Pershing, and you're expected to fight a tier 11 Object 432U, and the 432U, not only will it try to fight you, it will aggressively push you and only you, unless you can kite it into a position where you can can permatrack it or have one of your teammates deal with it. It is kind of an awkward part of the map, but as soon as you get through that, the game upgrades you into the 432U, and from that point on, it's basically smooth sailing. So even on rigorous mode, people are talking about ways to cheese it. You don't need to cheese it. It's not that hard. That being said, however, for a game mode that's not actually that difficult and shouldn't take the average player more than a few hours to complete, even on rigorous difficulty, it does give you a nice opportunity to preview some of the tier 11s and their new mechanics, and also gives you some pretty decent rewards if you do complete it on the highest difficulty. So generally speaking, I would recommend running through it. It is a pretty interesting experience, as long as you can get past the one encounter at the very beginning with the 432U. Of course, that naturally segues into a discussion on the new tier 11s. There are a large number of tier 11 tanks that got added with this one patch. This is likely the big rollout, with smaller rollouts and additional patches in the future, and tier 11s do work somewhat differently from the normal tanks. The first thing you'll notice is that in order to research them, you need 325,000 XP, but on top of that, you only need about 7.5 million silver. And this is an interesting point because I believe it was Quickie Baby that expressed surprise that it was only 7.5 million silver, because following on from the pattern of 3 million for tier 9 and then 6 million for tier 10, this should be 12 million. But after playing tier 10 enough to unlock this vehicle, I can say with pretty high certainty that if this was 12 million silver, these things would basically just be whale bait. Even 7.5 million is a bit of a stretch. The World of Tanks economy is kind of designed to end at tier 10, and tier 10 is not supposed to be a profitable tier, so having to grind out 325,000 XP at a tier that's not really that profitable and then also have to dig up 12 million silver would have been pretty insurmountable for a lot of players. On top of that, even the 7.5 million you have now could be pretty rough if you're not using the free gift that you got for logging in. Now, when you fully research a tier 10 vehicle, the vehicle is starting out in elite status, and the only other thing you potentially have to research are the field mods. Tier 11s don't work like that. They don't have elite status right away. They have a full upgrade tree you have to fill out, and this looks more like the upgrade tree for an RPG than it does for a tank game. This also brings up the point that tier 11 vehicles do not have field mods, at least not as of right now. I don't know if Wargaming are planning on adding them later, although it already does take a lot of XP to actually get through all of these upgrades. Now, you might reasonably think while looking at this tree that there are actual decisions in terms of where you go, but there kind of aren't. If you can see at the very end, it says 25 out of 25. You actually need all of the upgrades in order to get the fully modified vehicle, so there aren't really any choices as to what you're going to have on the ultimate finished vehicle, just what you want right now. In that respect, you basically still need all of them anyway, and after doing some quick math, the total number of XP required to go through a full vehicle, and it looks identical on all the tier 11s, is 325,000 XP. So all of the grinding you did to research the vehicle with your tier 10, now you have to do it again in your tier 11 to get your tier 11 fully upgraded. Once you get it upgraded and into elite status, there are some cosmetics you can get for getting it to certain numbers of elite status, like a kill tracker, a 3D skin, a gun sleeve, all that good stuff. Of course, you can't talk about researching the tier 10s without talking about their special abilities, because each one has a special ability, and some of them are more special than others. The Soviet tier 11, for example, just does more ramming damage. That's literally it. There's no special mechanic or key you can press. Whereas the German tier 11 light tank actually has a laser targeting shell that increases the damage the enemy takes, which is honestly such a League of Legends inspired skill that I was half expecting this tank to have a Rule 34 page on it. Before you ask, no, I have not checked, and if it does have one, no, I don't want to see it. So while the tier 11s do ultimately have some special abilities, some of them range from pretty outlandish and weird all the way to stuff that is pretty normal and doesn't feel like it needs to be on a tier 11 and could have just been on a regular tech tree tank. The Taschenrada is the German tier 11 heavy tank, and it really feels like it has one of the abilities that should be on a lot of other tanks, that is the ability to fire its secondary weapons on a cooldown. Essentially, you get a salvo of 4 high explosive rounds. They're only high explosive rounds, they don't do a ton of damage, but they can do things like knock out tracks or take out lighter vehicles, and that is on a cooldown that once it's ready you can fire it and you just wait until it's ready again. It doesn't burn any type of ammo or anything, and that's in addition to your main gun. Given how many other tanks in World of Tanks currently have secondary weapons modeled that perform absolutely no function, it does feel a little weird that this is only on the Taschenrada. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up all of the cool special abilities on these tier 11 tanks is if you look at this upgrade tree, while the circles increase a base stat, the diamonds actually buff your special ability. And this brings around to an interesting point. Wargaming very specifically mentioned that there are no trade-offs. This is pure buffs, so this is basically just an upgrade mechanic. This is not field mods where you have trade-offs on certain ones of the upgrades. Of course, that's all hypothetical. What is a practical example of how a system like this works? Well, because I already had the Batchat 25T for the World of Tanks vs. War Thunder comparison series, I decided to go straight for the AMX Extreme. Now, it does have an actual name, but the name has 2 X's in it, so I decided it wasn't really worth my time learning it. Anyway, the AMX Extreme does have a unique mechanic, quote unquote, but it's actually just a slightly different way in which its auto-loader works. The AMX Extreme has a mechanical ammo rack that when you reload, it will raise into position, load your gun for you, and then lower out of position, and you can stop the reloading at any time by hitting the reload button. And this feature seems more useful than it really is, because what in practice this means is that you have a lengthy animation both before and after your reload. So if you decide to stop the animation early because you really have a target you need to shoot at, you still need to wait for the animation of the mechanized ammo rack lowering. On top of that, the mechanized ammo rack only works if your turret's in a specific orientation, so as soon as you hit the reload button, your turret will lock into the forward orientation and it won't unlock until the closing animation is done. And all told, when you first unlock the AMX Extreme, the animation to both raise and lower the mechanized ammo rack is 4 seconds, and it's 6 seconds per shell, and that's not counting any time it may take for the turret to lock into the forward position. So on average, you're looking at close to 40 seconds to reload your 5-round magazine. But this also means that topping off the magazine with a single shell takes around 14 seconds when you're stock, which is really annoying. And I have a real question for you when looking at this upgrade chart. How many of these upgrades do you think does nothing but reduce the animation time? Did you say 4? Because the answer is 4. There are 4 separate upgrades that do nothing but reduce the obnoxious amount of time that you are stuck in these reload animations. Seriously, if you have to have 4 separate upgrades to reduce reload animation times, just make the animation shorter to begin with. Like, Jesus. If you do fully research it, it's around 2 seconds to raise and lower the mechanized ammo rack, so it's nowhere near as bad, but it is one of those features that makes it really annoying to stock grind this vehicle. And what is it with stock grinding? I thought I was done with stock grinding when I got done with tier 10. There's no stock grind for tier 10. You just get the field mods if you really want them. Now you get to tier 11 and you're back to stock grinding, but it's a long stock grind because there's 325,000 XP worth of upgrades to research. To give some quick rapid fire thoughts on the AMX Extreme before I go into conclusions about tier 11 as a whole, the vehicle is incredibly big. Honestly, if you drive this by an E100, you'll see that it's not that much smaller than an E100, but it also has no armor and only has 2k hit points unless you're taking other upgrades to increase its hit points. So it's a pretty big and easy target. As soon as you're spotted, you will get nailed, and because it is so large, it doesn't have great camo either, although the view range is pretty decent. I do think that stock the gun works really awkwardly. When you have it fully upgraded, it's fine. It's basically just a slightly more powerful Batchat, and that's kind of about it. On the whole, not really anything too terribly impressive. With that being said, the AMX Extreme does actually have an interesting feature because the mechanized ammo rack on the back of the tank doesn't have collision. However, it does have a hitbox. So if you back it through a wall and the enemy can see it on the other side of the wall, they can shoot it, they can hit it, and they can kill you, which is amazing. As for some overall thoughts on tier 11, I can't believe I'm bringing up Ship of Theseus, but I do have some valid questions in regards to this upgrade system. If I'm increasing the depression, increasing the elevation, reducing the reload time, increasing the traverse rate, at what point do I just have a different gun? Indeed, most of these tanks actually have upgrades that just increase their base alpha damage as well. So it's one of those, why is this not just a gun modification that I'm researching? Why is it several separate individual modifications? Or to put that in more simple terms, what is the difference between this upgrade chart and the standard module system? There are a few of them and it is notable, but in practice they end up being very similar. The first difference is that the tier 11s do not require any silver in order to install any of these upgrades, which, as I said before, is good because the silver economy in the game right now is not great and it isn't really built to support vehicles this expensive. The second major difference is that there aren't really any divergent paths you can take, it's just purely upgrading, although given how many of the goofy or one-off guns that were removed from tanks entirely or that were upgraded to be more in line with the standard gun, it does feel like Wargaming's philosophy in general was moving more towards straight upgrades rather than side grades. Another big selling point of this system in particular is that because you only need 10,000 or 20,000 per upgrade, you're getting upgrades at a more frequent basis even though they are smaller and less meaningful. Whereas if you have the module system, installing an entirely new gun, especially if scaled up to tier 11, could easily be 80 or 100,000 XP, whereas here you'll get at least a minor buff for it for 10 or 20,000 XP. With that being said, because you're getting such a minor bonus each time, very few of these feel satisfying to research in general. Most of them are just kind of meh. It feels more like you're ticking boxes to get ultimately to the end. So while the vehicle does feel very different when you play it fully upgraded versus stock, you don't really notice the differences as you go because they're so minor and incremental outside of some exceptions. Now, the next point I'm going to bring up about the tier 11s might feel a little pedantic, but stick with me, this is actually going somewhere. Several people have claimed that there is a historical design in the Leopard 120, which is a Leopard 1 with a 120mm Rheinmetall L44 cannon, and this is not technically correct. Here is the version of the Leopard 1 with 120 that is in World of Tanks, and here is the one in War Thunder. And here is the real Leopard 1 L44 in real life. You'll notice War Thunder actually copied the IRL L44 by using the cast turret instead of the welded turret, and Wargaming actually went with the welded turret, and that's because this is not an entirely historical Leopard 1 120, and part of the reason you can actually see if you look at the ammo types available. The ammo types available for this tank are APCR, normal heat, and high explosive. And any War Thunder player who has used the 120 is probably well aware that there is no APCR for that gun. I don't even think it was developed by Rheinmetall of Germany because by that point it would have been completely obsolete. This seems very pedantic, but it highlights the problem with both tier 11 and any potential move to tier 12 and beyond, and that is currently Wargaming's system is not designed to handle the more advanced shell like fin stabilized shells, which is what this gun should be firing. It's also not designed to handle composite armor or explosive reactive armor. So this puts a hard limit on what Wargaming can realistically add to this game, and this is probably part of the reason why Wargaming straight up admitted with the tier 11s that they were essentially alternate history. They were vehicles that theoretically could be built, which is a very vague term, but they weren't vehicles that were actually built or actually existed. War Thunder ultimately bit the bullet and went with these advanced shells and armor types a very long time ago, and while I do take some issue with their implementation, it did allow them to dramatically expand the roster of vehicles that can be added to the game, and I think Wargaming is probably going to have to do that at some point, and I feel like tier 11 was probably the best time to do it, but we'll see what happens in the future with that. So at this point, let's start migrating towards something vaguely resembling a conclusion. In terms of the tier 11s, I feel like Wargaming was always going to be between a rock and a hard place, and a lot of this boils down to the idea that if the tier 11s are introduced and they're all really underpowered, it's going to be very underwhelming, especially if they're the main selling point of an update. However, if they're all really overpowered, then all those tier 10 vehicles that people have dumped a lot of resources in over the course of the past decade and have maybe become very attached to, feel like they just got negated basically overnight. It's not really a great scenario either way for Wargaming because it doesn't really have the desired impact, and I feel like in their current power level the vehicles feel kind of fine. They don't feel wow-inducing, you're not rushing to get them, but they are at least kind of interesting in general outside of a few of them. But this does bring up the interesting point that because a lot of the tier 10s have been in the game for upwards of a decade, you now have this minor conundrum in terms of the collection element of the game. Anybody who's been playing a game, whether it be tabletop, card card game, whatever, when that game goes through a new edition change or when card games go through rotation, you will see a lot of players simply stop playing the game at that point, and that's because these collection-based games create an element of stickiness. Call it a sunk cost fallacy if you want, but it is very much a real thing, where players are reluctant to fully give up on it, even if they're not having the most fun. But as soon as you negate large parts of their old collection, or in rare cases even the entire old collection, now you've created a convenient off-ramp for anybody that wasn't really that satisfied with the game in its current state. So there's always a fundamental risk with doing a shift like this in terms of how your game is built and what players are working up to, wherein you can potentially allow players that would have stuck with your game, albeit somewhat reluctantly for a while, to simply see themselves to the door. With that being said, I don't feel like the tier 11s felt overpowered or the tier 10s felt particularly negated by the appearance of the tier 11s, but this is one of those only time will tell kind of situations. It's obviously very hard to gauge it at this point given how new they are. And one final note that's kind of about tier 11 but not really is when Awesome Epic guys were reviewing the 2.0 reveal trailer, they said every line is getting tier 11s eventually, and I understand what they mean by that, but I couldn't help but think that might not be the case. Specifically in the case of tier 11 artillery, Wargaming hasn't mentioned anything about tier 11 artillery, and even when they mention changes to the Matchmaker, they only mention things like tank destroyers and light tanks. At this point, it really feels like Wargaming is not developing the artillery class at all. It's been years upon years since any new artillery has been added, premium or tech tree, and it really feels like it's part of the game they're just kind of ashamed exists and want to move on from, but they can't really delete because it does have a dedicated player base for it. And in that vein, artillery was not mentioned anywhere in the reveal trailer at all, so I can't help but feel that if tier 11 artillery does come eventually, it's going to be very low on the priority list for Wargaming, and it wouldn't shock me if they released a statement saying something to the effect of, "We don't have any plans to develop that at this current moment," i.e. corporate speak for "we don't plan to do it." Moving past that into the general garage and UI changes, I don't think any of these will really change somebody's fundamental experience with the game. It's exceedingly rare unless these kind of UI changes are implemented incredibly well or incredibly poorly, wherein they actually have a meaningful impact in terms of your ability to retain players, as long as the players enjoy the overall gameplay loop of your game. So this is one of those areas where, while I do have some gripes and do feel like they could definitely continue to improve upon it, especially something like the armor viewer, I don't think it's really going to be catastrophic for the game as a whole, even if it is particularly annoying to some players. The biggest area where I feel like the UI does let down, as I said earlier, is definitely the cruise system. I really feel like the cruise system is probably one of the aspects of World of Tanks that new players have the hardest time getting a handle on and figuring out how to develop, and making it more difficult to see what status your crews have in terms of training skills, which ones have available skills to train and which skills are already trained, is not exactly great for helping the new player experience and getting accustomed to this facet of the game that is in fact very important, especially if they're going to stick with the game long term. This does naturally segue into the question of how well or poorly 2.0 has improved the new player experience, and honestly I'd say it's about the same. Certainly removing the multiple radios is a nice quality of life feature, as is removing the weight limitation on tracks, and the armor viewer might come in handy. I did personally find when I was opening a new account that the new player experience can definitely feel like it really lacks in terms of overall variety because of how Wargaming has somewhat gutted tiers 2 and 3 in terms of a lot of their variety and moved a lot of those vehicles over to the collector's side. This has resulted in a lot of scenarios that your first few games are the same tanks fighting against the other same tanks, and when Wargaming just straight up gave me the Tech 3 M3 Stuart right at the beginning, I couldn't help but feel that the game was almost embarrassed that its low tiers even existed and wanted to rush me into those mid and high tiers. But I feel like the low tiers is a great place to learn the game because a lot of the vehicles are pretty bad and they're matched up against other vehicles that are likewise pretty bad. When I first started playing the game on my old account, I actually really enjoyed those low tier experiences. The chaotic stupidity of all the vehicles with all these terrible weaknesses actually made for some pretty fun encounters, and that just doesn't really exist in the game anymore. On top of that, having a bunch of low tier vehicles that you could easily research within the first few hours of gameplay gave you a decent amount of variety and options to explore before you got thrown into the game proper. So I do feel like the game is missing some of its soul by removing some of these low tier vehicles and trying to rush you into the mid and high tier experience as fast as possible, and this isn't helped by the game just straight up giving you tier 10s if you log in right now. on the whole, I still feel like a lot of the core issues I had with the new player experience, that is to say the game doesn't do a great job of explaining how to use crews properly, how to use equipment setups and all that stuff, are still mostly there. The shallow learning curve of the basic game mechanics is still pretty solid, but as the complexity ramps up, you don't get any more explanations to try to help you with that additional complexity. And this is compounded by the fact that obviously it is a 15-year-old game at this point, so a lot of people playing it are very experienced. So quite a few of the people that you'll run into at the mid tiers are going to be rocking equipment loadouts and high tier crews, which essentially is going to put you at a disadvantage even if you're in an identical vehicle, and this could definitely result in some frustration or confusion from a newer player that doesn't fully understand it. This isn't really helped by the fact that the crew system is still not very good. It still takes a lot of silver to move a crew to another tank and a lot of time to fully train them on another tank, even if you are paying silver. So unless you're paying gold to move crew members as you go, you're going to have trouble building up the crew skills you need by the time you need them. On top of that, if somebody comes in after the point where all of these special bonuses for 2.0 comes out, they're not going to have this large war chest to work with, so they're probably not going to have that much equipment on their vehicles either when they're fighting enemies that have fully equipped and fully crewed vehicles. So in general, I still feel like the game doesn't do a great job of easing you into these more complex systems as it goes up, and I don't feel like the game does a great job of showing you all the different playstyles and variety when you first get started playing. And naturally, all of that is going to be really compounded by the fact that if you do choose a line like light tanks that heavily rely on crew skills and equipment to be effective, you're going to have a really tough time moving up those tech trees as a free-to-play player. As for the returning player experience, I'm not entirely sure this gets helped out a lot by 2.0 either. Certainly there is a lot of content, so if your issue was a lack of free-to-play content, this is on offer in spades in 2.0 with the addition of the tier 11s, and honestly with more of them probably to come. The matchmaker might be a plus or minus. Honestly, it could be really good for you, could be really bad for you, or do nothing, and it heavily depends on the types of vehicles you like to play and the specific server and time of day you play, because obviously at non-peak hours on lower population servers, the matchmaker is going to end up being a lot looser than it is at times of day where a lot of players are on more populated servers. So depending on what region you're in and when you play, you might not even notice the new matchmaker. But a lot of the other reasons why you might have stopped playing World of Tanks, such as overpowered premiums, monetization, the overall game economy, the lack of frontal weak points, the somewhat outlandish designs, and the increasingly out of place cosmetics, none of these are really solved by 2.0. So I'm not really seeing, if you're a returning player, why this would change your mind on the game itself. For the players that are currently maining World of Tanks, I feel like this patch is a welcome breath of fresh air, because you actually do add a fair amount of new content in terms of the tier 11s in general, their specific abilities. There's ultimately a lot of content to grind through, and also the promise of a lot more content coming in the future. So this is a pretty nice patch for people that already are playing the game and have been playing the game for a long time, and also gives you some nice rewards for doing so that will help get the tier 11 grind started. On top of that, the rebalancing combined with making some of the stock configurations more viable, and also removing some of the more tedious aspects like researching an additional radio or the weight limit on tracks, is going to be more noticeable to a veteran player than to a newer player or a returning player, because you've obviously been playing the game this entire time, and it will make it easier to acquire that extra tech tree that you were looking at but didn't get with the tier 10 boost reward. Ultimately, however, I do feel like WOT 2.0 did highlight some major issues with the economy, given how much wargaming had to boost it just to make sure the launch of 2.0 is not a complete flop, and that will almost certainly require a significant visit on their part later, or it's going to come to a pretty big head at some point. I also feel like at this point, because a lot of the monetization is coming increasingly from loot boxes and the grind is less of a monetization scheme, that certain really tedious aspects of the grind aspect that are perhaps a little outdated, such as garage slots or crew training, could perhaps be simplified, truncated, or removed entirely, simply to allow new players to get access to the things that the average person they're going to be playing against already has in spades. Ultimately, it feels like there's not quite as much acknowledgement in this update that World of Tanks is a 15-year game, and thus there are a lot of veterans, which means even as early as tier 4 or 5, you're going to start running into vehicles with fully loaded crews and equipment, and that's going to be a very tall ask if your crew doesn't even have a single crew skill researched. So will World of Tanks 2.0 save World of Tanks? The answer is yes, but kind of no, but kind of yes. earlier this year, in order to restart Warzone, Activision released the old Verdansk map with also some gameplay changes. It was very well received, it saw a big surge in players, and generally it was reviewed positively. However, at this point, the hype has almost completely died down, and Verdansk isn't that much more populated than it was when it originally launched. And this does kind of highlight that when you have these properties like World of Tanks or like Call of Duty that have been around long enough that a lot of people will recognize them simply by name, announcing a big update will give you a nice big surge in players, but whether or not you will be able to retain them long term is another question entirely. And WOT 2.0 has seen that surge in players, but it still remains to be seen how many of them will stick around once the hype of 2.0 wears off and all of the free gifts start to fade away. For me personally, I'm not really seeing enough from Wargaming in terms of their overall awareness that perhaps some of their decisions were what led to needing a 2.0 in the first place, so I anticipate we're going to see a lot of repeats of old problems once the shine of 2.0 wears off. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. What are your thoughts on World of Tanks 2.0? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, just a reminder, if you haven't picked it up, make sure to pick up your rewards before the October patch goes live, just to get your free tier 10. Really no reason not to. There's no downside to having an account with a tier 10 on it. If you liked the video, found it informative, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.